Picture this. You walked into a grocery store this week, picked up a loaf of bread that looked completely ordinary, and paid for it without a second thought. Now imagine finding out that loaf may carry measurable traces of the same chemical farmers spray on weeds. Sounds unlikely, right? Except this isn't happening with some sketchy off-brand nobody has heard of. We're talking about loaves sitting front and center on the shelf of nearly every major grocery chain in the country. Some wear an organic label proudly. Some cost more precisely because shoppers assume premium price means premium safety. And these are the exact loaves millions of households grab week after week, fully convinced they're protecting their families by choosing well. Here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. This isn't internet rumor or influencer speculation. Independent laboratories, using recognized testing methods, ran the numbers, and what came back doesn't line up with what the packaging promises. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly which well-known bread brands have reportedly tested positive for glyphosate residue, why some organic loaves shockingly performed worse than their conventional competitors, which 3 brands have actually earned a reputation for cleaner sourcing backed by real testing, and a few simple rules you can carry into the bread aisle starting today. Here's the twist, though. The real shock in this story isn't which brand scored the worst. It's realizing how many shoppers place their trust in labels that were never built to answer the question they think they're asking. Stick around, because once you see what's really happening behind the packaging on these shelves, you will never shop for bread the same way again. Before we dig into brand names and lab numbers, there's one core idea worth lodging in your mind, because everything else builds from it. This isn't really a story about bread. It's a story about the space between what a label tells you and what a laboratory actually finds. Most shoppers work from a completely reasonable set of assumptions. Organic must mean clean. Whole grain must mean nutritious. Natural must mean safe. Nobody should feel foolish for thinking this way, especially since the entire food marketing industry has poured enormous effort into reinforcing exactly that impression. But here's the catch. Organic certification is a judgment about how a crop was grown in the field. It says nothing about whether every single loaf that reaches the shelf has been tested for herbicide residue. That gap matters more than most people realize. A farm can follow every organic growing standard to the letter, and its grain can still pick up contamination from a neighboring conventional field, from shared silos and transport trucks, or from processing equipment that handles both organic and non-organic grains side by side. So an organic sticker and a lab report answer 2 entirely different questions. The label tells you the seed was grown without deliberate pesticide use. The lab tells you what actually showed up inside the loaf sitting in your kitchen. Those 2 things are not interchangeable, and for years, most shoppers never realized they'd been asking the wrong one. By the time we're through today, you'll understand why some of the most recognizable bread brands scored higher on residue tests than almost anyone would expect. Why certain certified organic products landed on the wrong side of independent lab results, what's actually hiding inside the ingredient panel of many commercial loaves that most people never bother reading, which 3 brands have made real, verifiable commitments to transparency and cleaner sourcing, and a shopping method so simple you won't need to memorize a single brand name to use it. No scare tactics, no manufactured drama, just facts laid out clearly so you walk out of the store with real control over your next purchase. Quick note before we get into it. If you're looking for straightforward, science-backed ways to cut down on unnecessary chemical exposure, support healthy aging, and make sharper everyday food choices, I put together a longevity guide covering exactly that, including the food picks, shopping strategies, and daily habits I walk through with my own patients. The link is in the description below. Now let's get into it properly. I'm Dr. William Parker, and I've spent the last 21 years in clinical practice watching how small, repeated decisions made almost automatically in a grocery aisle quietly shape a person's health over years and decades. I want to be upfront that this isn't about frightening you. I am not telling you a slice of sandwich bread is going to wreck your health, because that's simply not what the evidence supports. What I am doing is handing you accurate information so your decisions come from understanding rather than panic. One pattern shows up again and again in my practice. The belief that a higher price tag automatically means a healthier product, and that the word organic automatically means chemical-free. Both beliefs are understandable, both are also incomplete in ways that quietly work against the very people holding them. So let's take that apart, starting with glyphosate itself. Glyphosate is the active ingredient inside a widely used commercial weed killer called Roundup. Farmers have relied on it for decades, and it remains one of the most heavily applied herbicides in modern agriculture. Here's the specific reason it turns up in bread. There's a common practice in wheat farming called pre-harvest application. Shortly before the crop is harvested, some farms spray glyphosate directly onto the wheat to dry it out faster and more evenly, which speeds up harvesting. The consequence is that wheat treated this way can arrive at the mill, still carrying measurable chemical residue. That wheat gets ground into flour, baked into bread, and those residues ride along into the finished loaf on the shelf. Independent lab testing has picked up measurable glyphosate levels across a wide range of commercial bread sold throughout the United States. Does that automatically mean a confirmed health emergency? No. The scientific community is genuinely split. Some researchers argue the levels found in everyday food are far too small to cause measurable harm. Others point to a growing body of research suggesting that even small, repeated, long-term exposure deserves serious attention, particularly for children and pregnant women. I'm not here to settle that argument for you. What I want is to put the facts on the table so you can make your own informed call. And the first fact is simple. These residues are showing up in products a huge number of people assume are clean. Many of those same people would likely make a different choice if they knew. So let's name names. Several independent reports and lab analyses have identified measurable glyphosate residue in products from some very familiar brands. Great Value, Market Pantry Organic, Roundy Organic Wheat, Nature's Own, Arnold Organic, Wonder Bread, Sara Lee, Honey Wheat, Pepperidge Farm, Dave's Killer Bread, and the 365 Whole Foods store brand. Sit with that for a second. Several of these carry the word organic right in their name or marketing. Dave's Killer Bread has built its entire identity around being the cleaner, more conscious alternative. The 365 brand is sold exclusively through Whole Foods, a chain plenty of shoppers walk into specifically because they trust it holds a higher standard. And yet some of the highest glyphosate readings recorded in independent testing came from precisely these premium positioned products. The 365 Whole Foods whole wheat loaf reportedly came back above 1,000 parts per billion in some tests, among the highest figures discussed across independent reports. I want to be careful and precise here. These numbers come from independent testing organizations, not official government regulatory determinations, and different testing methods along with different product batches can produce different results. But the broader pattern, that organic and premium branded products are not consistently beating out conventional ones, is genuinely significant. It directly contradicts what a great many shoppers believe every time they reach for those products. And the explanation traces right back to that core distinction. Organic certification tracks how the crop was farmed, not whether the finished product avoided contamination through a shared supply chain, shared storage, or shared processing equipment. A farm can do everything right by organic standards and still end up with grain that picked up residue from a neighboring conventional field, a shared grain elevator, or a mill that processes both organic and non-organic wheat on the same equipment. For anyone buying organic specifically to avoid chemical exposure in the finished loaf they actually eat, that gap between expectation and reality deserves to be understood clearly rather than assumed away. Now let's add another layer, because glyphosate is only part of the picture. Pick up a loaf of commercial bread and actually read the ingredient panel, something most shoppers skip entirely. Here's a typical list: enriched flour, water, high fructose corn syrup, yeast, soybean oil, salt, calcium propionate, Datem, sodium stearoyl, lactylate, monoglycerides, calcium sulfate, ammonium sulfate, and various enzymes. In plain language, calcium propionate is a mold inhibitor, the reason bread can sit on your counter for 2 or 3 weeks without spoiling. Your grandmother's homemade bread molded within a week, and that wasn't a flaw. It was a sign of real food behaving the way real food does. Datem and sodium stearoyl lactylate are emulsifiers and dough conditioners that make texture softer and more uniform, increase loaf volume, and extend shelf life. Monoglycerides are fat-based additives that bind ingredients and create that soft, uniform texture you feel in commercial bread. None of this means any single ingredient makes the bread acutely dangerous. Regulators generally judge these additives safe at typical levels. But here's the honest question worth sitting with. When did bread turn into something that requires 14 or 15 manufactured additives just to hold together on a shelf? The answer is straightforward. It happened the moment bread stopped being a simple staple and became an industrial product engineered to stay soft, stay shelf-stable, and get produced as cheaply as possible. Once you see that, an ingredient list stops looking like a wall of chemistry terms and starts looking like a window into how a product was designed and who that design was really serving. Understanding what you're actually buying is one of the most powerful tools any shopper can carry into a store, and it costs nothing but a few extra seconds spent flipping a package over. Here's something else worth knowing. You might look at 30 different brands lined up on a shelf and assume you're looking at 30 independent companies, each making its own independent choices. That's not quite accurate. A surprisingly small number of massive parent corporations control most of that shelf space. Grupo Bimbo, one of the largest food companies on the planet, owns Sara Lee, Nature's Own, Wonder Bread, and a long list of other familiar names. Flowers Foods owns Dave's Killer Bread, along with several other labels. Amazon, through its ownership of Whole Foods, controls the strategy and distribution of the entire 365-store brand. What this means in practice is that products priced and marketed as though they're worlds apart often come from remarkably similar supply chains, similar ingredient sourcing, and similar manufacturing playbooks. The packaging looks different, the price tag looks different, the marketing story sounds different, but underneath, the production logic is frequently identical. When shoppers pay extra for what they believe is a fundamentally different product, they deserve to know what that premium is actually buying them. And often, the honest answer is simply different packaging wrapped around a different marketing narrative. So what's a shopper supposed to do with all this? A handful of consistent markers separate genuinely better bread from the rest. First, a short ingredient list. Bread was made successfully for thousands of years with essentially 4 ingredients: flour, water, yeast, and salt. Second, sprouted grain. Sprouted grain bread uses whole grains allowed to germinate before processing, which improves nutrient availability and digestibility, and tends to come from smaller companies with shorter, more transparent ingredient lists. Third, independent testing certification. Organizations like the Detox Project's glyphosate residue-free certification and the Non-GMO Project verification actually test the finished product itself, not just the farming method, which is a meaningfully different and more useful standard than organic certification alone. Fourth, refrigerated or frozen storage. If bread sits at room temperature for weeks without a trace of mold, something was added to create that unnatural stability. Bread kept cold generally needs far fewer preservatives. With those markers in mind, 3 brands consistently rise above the rest. Food for Life's Ezekiel 4:9 is the best-known sprouted grain bread in the U.S., made from sprouted wheat, barley, millet, lentils, soybeans, and spelt, carrying Non-GMO Project verification, sold frozen so it needs no chemical preservatives. 1 Degree Organics offers real traceability, letting you look up where the grain in your bread came from, specifically tests for glyphosate, and carries residue-free certification with clean, short ingredient lists. Silver Hills Sprouted Bakery, another sprouted grain brand, uses organic, non-GMO ingredients with relevant certifications and lives in the refrigerated and frozen sections. None of these 3 is flawless, but each has done real, verifiable work to separate itself from the mainstream commercial bread market. Here's something even more useful than memorizing 3 names, because in a crowded aisle, it's easy to forget specifics. Turn the loaf over, find the ingredient list, and count how many items appear. If a loaf lists more than 7 or 8 ingredients, especially several you couldn't define without a food science background, ask yourself whether this is really the product the front of the package implied it was. This conversation was never really about glyphosate specifically. That's just the detail that grabs headlines. The deeper story is about the relationship between what food companies communicate and what their products actually contain. The food industry has become extraordinarily skilled at crafting labels that generate feelings of trust and safety without technically making a false claim. Words like natural, wholesome, and artisan carry no strict regulatory definition. They're marketing language designed to make you feel a certain way, not to inform you. Independent lab testing is one of the few tools that cuts through that language, and the consistent finding is that labels and lab results don't always line up. A fair question always comes up here. Isn't glyphosate essentially everywhere? In soil, water, even air? You can't avoid it entirely, so why focus on bread specifically? Because bread ranks among the most frequently consumed foods in the American diet, showing up at multiple meals a day for countless families. Frequency of exposure matters. Reducing exposure in a high-frequency food is one of the most practical steps anyone can take. This isn't about chasing zero exposure, which is unrealistic. It's about making smarter decisions in the categories that matter most because of how often they appear in daily life. Cost is also a real and legitimate concern, and pretending otherwise wouldn't be honest. The brands highlighted generally cost more than mainstream commercial bread, with Ezekiel bread often running $6 to $8 versus $2 or $3 for a mainstream loaf. That gap is real. If budget is tight, here are a few practical approaches worth considering. First, prioritize your highest frequency uses. If bread shows up at nearly every meal in your house, even shifting 2 or 3 servings a week toward a cleaner option meaningfully reduces overall exposure without requiring you to overhaul everything at once. Second, consider baking bread at home. Traditional bread made with organic flour, water, yeast, and salt costs a reasonable amount per loaf and contains exactly what you decided to put into it. Nothing hidden and nothing unexpected. If bread consumption is high in your household, learning one simple recipe is genuinely one of the most cost-effective quality upgrades available. Third, look toward the frozen section and buy in batches, since purchasing 2 or 3 loaves at once and freezing them can meaningfully lower the cost per serving over time. None of this pretends to be an easy fix, but within the realistic range of options most households have, there are practical ways to move toward cleaner choices without breaking the bank. One more detail worth understanding: that long shelf life. Commercial sandwich bread can sit on your counter for 2 to 3 weeks and still look and feel nearly identical to the day you bought it. That gets marketed to you as a feature. More convenient, less waste, better quality. But stop and think about what that actually means. Bread made purely from flour, water, yeast, and salt begins to go stale within a couple of days and shows visible mold within roughly a week under normal conditions. That's simply the natural behavior of real, unmodified food. So when a bread product resists that entire process for 2 to 3 weeks, something has clearly intervened along the way, specifically preservatives and modified ingredients designed to slow or block the biological processes that make real bread go stale on its own timeline. When you see a loaf mold within 7 days, that's actually evidence it doesn't contain excessive preservatives. When you see one still looking picture perfect on day 18, that's evidence of something else entirely happening beneath the surface. And watch the label language, because it directly changes how you should read the claims printed on packaging. The phrase "made with whole grains" ranks among the most commonly used health claims on commercial bread, and technically, in most cases, it's accurate. Many commercial breads genuinely do contain some whole grain flour, but that phrase tells you absolutely nothing about what percentage of the total flour is whole grain versus refined white flour. A product can legally carry the phrase even if whole grains make up only a small fraction of the overall blend, while the majority of that flour is still refined, stripped of its natural fiber and nutritional value, and the label remains completely accurate the entire time. Similarly, the word multigrain simply means more than one type of grain was used somewhere in the recipe. It says absolutely nothing about whether those grains are whole or refined. So look specifically at where whole wheat flour appears within the ingredient list itself. Ingredients are always listed in descending order by weight. If enriched flour, which is simply refined white flour under a friendlier name, appears first on that list, refined flour is the largest single component of that bread, regardless of whatever claim appears proudly on the front of the package. But if whole wheat flour or sprouted wheat appears first instead, that's a meaningfully different product, even when both loaves carry nearly identical health-oriented language splashed across their packaging. Here's a complete practical framework to carry into the store starting on your very next trip. First, turn the package over before looking at anything printed on the front, because that's genuinely the most important real estate on the entire package. Second, count the ingredients, since fewer is almost always better, so aim for products with fewer than 8 ingredients whenever it's realistically possible. Third, look closely at the first ingredient specifically, because enriched flour listed first means refined white flour is the primary component of that loaf, regardless of whatever other claims decorate the front, while whole wheat flour, sprouted wheat, or whole grain spelt listed first means you're starting from a genuinely better foundation. Fourth, look for third-party testing certifications, specifically non-GMO project verification and glyphosate residue-free certification, since these involve actual laboratory testing of the finished product itself rather than simply an evaluation of farming method. Fifth, pay attention to storage location, since bread kept in the freezer section generally contains far fewer chemical preservatives than bread designed to survive weeks sitting at room temperature. Sixth, give yourself permission to prioritize instead of chasing perfection, focusing specifically on whatever bread your household actually eats most often, and simply start there. Seventh, when you're genuinely unsure, look for Food for Life's Ezekiel 4:9, 1 Degree Organics, or Silver Hills Sprouted Bakery, the 3 brands that have done the most verifiable work to separate themselves from the mainstream commercial bread market. That's 7 straightforward steps, and not one of them requires a nutrition degree or a complete overhaul of your grocery budget. Every single one of them hands you genuinely more useful information than any marketing claim splashed across the front of a bread package ever could. I want to say something directly to you as we head toward the close, because I think it genuinely matters. It can feel overwhelming the moment you start learning about the gap between how food gets marketed and what independent testing actually reveals underneath that marketing. I watch patients move through this exact process regularly, that initial sting of something close to betrayal when they realize a product they trusted for years was never telling them the full story. But push through that feeling quickly and get yourself to the far more useful emotional place on the other side of it, which is genuine empowerment. You now know noticeably more than the average shopper standing in that same bread aisle. You know precisely what to look for on an ingredient list. You understand the real difference between a farming certification and a finished product testing certification. You know which brands have actually invested in real transparency rather than just talking about it. You know that an unusually long shelf life is frequently a sign of chemical intervention rather than genuine quality. And you know how to read that first ingredient and understand exactly what it reveals about a product's true composition. That knowledge travels with you into every single grocery trip from this point forward, and it doesn't stop at bread either. The exact same skills, reading ingredient lists carefully, distinguishing marketing language from meaningful certification, watching for genuine third-party testing, apply across nearly every category on every shelf in that store. Once this becomes a habit, it turns into second nature, and it changes not just what ends up in your cart, but how you relate to food marketing as a whole from here on out. The food industry counts heavily on people never flipping the package over to read the back. The more clearly you understand that, the more easily you can see straight through language that was designed purely to make you feel good rather than to actually inform you. To bring it all together, we covered what glyphosate is and how it gets into bread, why its presence in organic products surprised so many people, the specific brands named in independent testing, the long ingredient lists in commercial bread, and what those additives actually do, the corporate consolidation behind seemingly independent brands, what sets Food for Life, 1 Degree Organics, and Silver Hills apart, and a complete, practical framework you can use immediately. The label on the front of a food package is designed to create a feeling, not inform a decision. Laboratory testing, real third-party certifications, and your own careful reading of the ingredient list are the tools that actually inform decisions. Use them. If today's video gave you something useful, subscribe for more clear, evidence-based content on nutrition and healthy aging, and check out the longevity guide linked in the description below. Thank you for watching. Take what you learned here, use it on your next grocery trip, and share it with someone who'd benefit from it. I'll see you in the next one.